Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our program, Exposing China's Complicity in America's Fentanyl Crisis. Please welcome Andrew Harding, Research Assistant in the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andrew Harding, a research assistant here in the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center. And thank you for joining us today in person or online. America faces a deadly fentanyl crisis. For context, in 2023 alone, the U.S. death toll from fentanyl and opioid poisoning deaths were more than the total of U.S. casualties from the entire Vietnam War. As Mexican cartels and drug trafficking wreak havoc on American communities every day, today's panelists aim to direct America's attention to the supplier of this deadly crisis, the Chinese Communist Party. To analyze China's culpability in America's fentanyl crisis, we'll soon hear from a star-studded panel featuring Steve Yates, Carrie Filippetti, Andres Fernandez-Martinez, and Jeff Smith as the moderator. Steve is a senior fellow and the chair of the China Policy Initiative at the America First Policy Initiative. He served previously as president of Radio Free Asia, was a national security advisor during the Bush administration, and served as the chair of the Idaho Republican Party. Carrie is the executive director at the Vandenberg Coalition. Carrie previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cuba and Venezuela in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs and the Deputy Special Representative for Venezuela at the U.S. State Department. She also served as an EMT during the pandemic, providing her an eyewitness and firsthand accounts of the crisis that we're facing in this country today. Andres is the Senior Policy Analyst for Latin America and the Heritage Foundation's Allison Center for National Security, where he leads Heritage's work on U.S. policy towards Latin America. Jeff is the Director of the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center and previously served as the Director of Asian Security Programs at the American Foreign Policy Council. Before we jump into today's panel, we're pleased to share a short video detailing America's fentanyl crisis that will help set the tone for today's conversation. Once the video concludes, the panel will come on stage. Thank you again for attending today's event, and we hope you enjoy the program. Please roll the video.
Every day, over 200 Americans lose their lives to fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that brings to the U.S. an annual death toll that surpasses the total U.S. casualties from the Vietnam War. This crisis is not just a tragic accident. It's a deliberate act fueled by the Chinese Communist Party with the aid of deadly Mexican cartels. Evidence uncovered by the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party reveals that the CCP is actively subsidizing the production and export of fentanyl precursors to Mexican drug cartels and ultimately the United States.
We have to recognize that this is an intentional poisoning of Americans, and we need it to stop.
The impact on American communities is devastating. Families are torn apart, and lives are lost every single day. Unfortunately, the United States has failed to confront the foreign enablers of the fentanyl crisis, leaving the American people to shoulder the burden.
It's very deliberate. Everybody in the world knows what fentanyl is doing. China knows it, and they're making it.
It doesn't matter what the Communist Party says they're doing. They are allowing these to come in and kill Americans every day.
The United States does not have to be a helpless victim of this weaponized drug crisis. It can and must confront the transnational fentanyl networks and protect the trade, financial, and healthcare systems of the United States. That starts with holding the Chinese Communist Party and Mexico's cartels accountable for their role in America's fentanyl crisis.
Good morning, everyone joining in the audience today. Thanks for being with us in person. Thanks to this esteemed panel for doing this event today. Big thanks to Andrew Harding for introducing us. Andrew was also the co-author of a blockbuster heritage report that will be released later today on the fentanyl crisis, a co-author along with Andres. We'll have a link available for everyone later today. I encourage you to check that out for yourself. I'm going to invoke moderator privilege just to make one or 2 points that I think will help set the scene here for this discussion, and then we're going to dive right into direct questions to our panelists, and hopefully we'll have time at the end for audience Q&A. So the first point I want to make, and I'm going to make it slowly for dramatic effect, the Chinese government is not only allowing, but incentivizing a drug trade that is killing roughly 75,000 Americans per year. More specifically, Chinese entities are exporting the chemical precursors for fentanyl to Mexican drug cartels that are smuggling it into the United States. It's been happening for years. We've known about it for years. The Chinese government, when told about it, pretends as if it doesn't know the trade is happening, and to the degree it does, it will crack down on the trade. That has not happened. It is not believable to us that a government that knows when you Google Winnie the Pooh doesn't know about the multi-billion-dollar drug trade and these precursors being exported to the United States. It is not plausible. In 30 cumulative years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, we had roughly 6,900 Americans killed in action. The same amount of Americans die every month from fentanyl overdoses. That's 2 9/11s every month, every year. And everyone seems oddly lackadaisical about all of this. You would think this would be a national crisis on the headlines every day. It's not. And frankly, China will continue doing so until the United States raises the cost enough for China to stop. And I would argue we haven't done that yet. What we have done is engage in this sort of performative exchange of grievances. So we say to the Chinese government, we would really appreciate it if you would stop stealing intellectual property from the United States to the tune of trillions of dollars. And they say, yes, of course, we would never do that. You know, please stop thrashing around the South China Sea like Thanos looking for an infinity stone. Stop harassing your neighbors. Of course, we'll stop that right away. They do the same thing to us. Unveil their list of 12 no's and 15 unmentionables, and we sort of have this performative exchange of grievances. We've put fentanyl in that category, and it doesn't belong there. It belongs in the category of core interests and red lines. And just the way that China says, if you do certain things on Taiwan independence, it will cause Armageddon and a conflict, and it will destroy our relationship, fentanyl needs to be put on the same plateau, because that's how much it matters to us. And we must force the Chinese government to understand that, and the Mexican cartels. So that's my quick shtick on this issue. Now you can hear from the real experts who have spent a lot of time thinking about this problem. And Andres, if it's okay, I thought we could start with you because you were the co-author of this major report being released today. So maybe you could set us up with a preview of some of the key takeaways and recommendations.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jeff. Well, I think one of the key takeaways that we got from our time researching this crisis and all the actors involved is that this is really fundamentally different from the drug challenges that the U.S. has faced for decades in the form of cocaine, for example. This, both in its severity and speed with which this has become a challenge and a crisis for the United States, which, as you outlined, the numbers in comparison to wars, we are now facing annually since 2021 over 70,000 overdose deaths just from fentanyl in the U.S. Each year. And so that's surpassing 20 years of Vietnam war casualties for the U.S. And that's something that go back 10 years and when fentanyl was a fraction of U.S. overdose deaths. So this has become a major crisis within a very fast period of time and takes a dramatic toll on U.S. citizens. And part of the reason that it has become so quickly a major crisis is that it is at its origin directed and supported by our top the top adversary of the U.S. In China. We see the Chinese government, Chinese actors at the heart of this crisis. The outflow of fentanyl precursor chemicals centers within China and travels into Mexico, travels into the United States itself even. And they have actors within China, companies, pharmaceutical companies, chemical companies, and criminal organizations which operate with impunity within China with no attempt to crack down on this crisis. As you alluded, that in a country where a mild speech is cracked down with great intensity, a massive criminal network that spans the globe and has its heart in China sees no repercussions or enforcement efforts. So that's really again the severity of the crisis and its origin and directed nature is really how it differentiates itself from the longstanding drug challenges that we've seen in the U.S. And unfortunately, we haven't really had a different approach as far as U.S. policy on that front. We've taken an approach that really, particularly under this administration, exports efforts to address the fentanyl crisis to the Chinese government, hoping that they will take care of this crisis when we know that they're doing quite the opposite and incentivizing it, and doing the same in the case of Mexico to entreat the Mexican government, which has deep corruption, ties with the cartels, and leadership, the current president, which actually denies that fentanyl is even produced within the country. He's done that several times. So again, these are essentially the hopes of the U.S. strategy against fentanyl, the Chinese government and corrupt Mexican government as well, to address what is a deep and severe crisis for the United States. So the challenges are really severe, and unfortunately, our policies have not risen to face this challenge in the way that they should.
Thank you for that, Andres. I know, having previewed the paper, that you do go into some detail about how the Mexican cartels purchase and acquire these fentanyl precursors. Could you shed a little more light on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of this is much less secretive than one would expect. And again, in part because these companies in China, these individuals in China operate with relative impunity and advertise really their sales, their exports in a way that makes it very obvious that these are they're targeting criminal organizations, cartels as buyers, and we'll set up websites, talk about and set up all sorts of illicit payment networks and methods to facilitate those transactions, usually through third-party brokers and shell companies, which have direct connections to larger Chinese companies that are established, and the U.S. Imports medicine and other chemicals from. You have direct ties between these two, and then you have these actors that bring these intermediaries that bring these chemicals, export them en masse to Mexico in particular, where the cartels again operate with impunity. They produce finished fentanyl, bringing the chemicals through ports with the aid of and with corrupt officials looking the other way. They produce the fentanyl throughout the country, even within Mexico City, which is again one of the centers where the Mexican government and security forces pride themselves on maintaining the rule of law. Even there, this is a challenge that they haven't addressed. All these networks that the Mexican cartels have developed over decades in terms of transnational smuggling of drugs, money laundering. It's really offered a plug-and-play opportunity for these Chinese entities to export fentanyl and ship that en masse to the United States. So it's a advanced and very sophisticated network that spans continents. And unfortunately, again, our response policy-wise is really lacking, even on the resourcing to confront this challenge.
Thank you. Carrie, I know you've been following this issue closely for many years. Would you care to shed a light on how China domestically produces these fentanyl precursors and then sends them on to Mexico and North America?
First of all, I also want to thank the Heritage Foundation for organizing this event, because I think it's really important that we all understand that fentanyl is not exclusively a domestic issue. This is also a foreign policy issue, and I think this is the right framing. I'll put it even more dramatically, Jeff, than you did, which is this is essentially a silent war being waged against the United States. As we heard, Vietnam War, 58,000 people killed over the course of a decade. We're getting more than that every single year being killed by fentanyl here in the United States. And this is an active choice by the CCP in order to try to undermine American resilience and American strength. So I'll answer your question sort of in two ways, Jeff. One is the sort of why China and what China is doing, but then also why Mexico, because I think that really matters as to sort of how Mexico is creating the conditions for this, especially as we face this astronomical and unprecedented border crisis, which is very related to what we're talking about here. So just to give you a sense of how these things are proliferating through Mexico, a few years ago, Northcom assessed that about 35% of Mexican territory was under the full control of Mexican cartels. Full control. There's estimates that as high as 70% of Mexican territory is under at least partial control by some of these cartels. So we're talking about real strength within these criminal organizations. And it's not something that only matters as it relates to China and fentanyl. This is also being exploited by Iran. It's being exploited by Russia. It's being exploited by all of America's adversaries. The second is the sort of weak leadership at the national level within Mexico. So you'll see in the report, they mentioned that the former president of Mexico, AMLO, had issued this hugs, not bullets policy to counter the proliferation of drugs and crime. As a result, we see that Mexico has the lowest rate of incarceration for homicide. For example, only 1%, just over 1% of homicides in Mexico actually see justice get done. That's lower than the rates in Syria. That's lower than the rates in Afghanistan, right? So we're talking about a fully incompetent leadership, at least as it relates to the judicial process within Mexico. And we also saw in 2020 that Mexico started to be really suspicious of engagement with other countries, notably not the CCP, but the United States. They passed something called the Foreign Agents Law, which made it really difficult to do the important security cooperation work that is required for a successful counter-narcotics and counter-drug policy coming from the United States. And then I would just say, as a result of the border crisis, we now see the two largest cartels in Mexico are present in all 50 states in the United States. So this is something that is affecting everywhere. In terms of why China and how China, what we have to remember is there's essentially two main sources of drugs, right? There's sort of the plant-based natural sources. This is what we were typically dealing with. Think about cocaine, think about what I will call the original version of meth, and you'll see why I say that in a minute. So those require a lot of labor. This was what the cartels were typically involved in, but it requires you to be mindful of crop cycles. It requires you to be mindful of planting and what the weather looks like and so on. So over the last few years, a decade or so, we've seen a shift more towards the synthetic drugs, the manufactured drugs. That's that second major category. This is where fentanyl is, right? So this is a chemically created drug. And so who are the people with most of those chemicals? pharmaceutical companies. And of course, fentanyl is used in hospital settings and has a very important use in hospital settings. So when you see what China is doing, essentially they recognize that they had access to all of these chemicals, what we call the chemical precursors, those things that can be mixed into fentanyl or other drugs. And because the PRC has such a large pharmaceutical industry, that became a logical home for all of these precursor chemical production. We also, I'm sure we'll get into that the CCP is directly incentivizing and encouraging the production of those chemicals to be sent to Mexico. I should also note that when we talk about the drug crisis in the United States, fentanyl is, of course, the largest percentage of overdose deaths. We should call them poisoning deaths, by the way, as opposed to overdose. Many people who are taking them are not aware that they're even ingesting fentanyl. But I mentioned meth as well. You all live in Washington, D.C. I'm sure you have all experienced these tent cities. You see people with a lot of like hoarding tendencies and so on. That's meth, but that's the new meth. That is the chemically created meth. Meth used to be created from a plant derivative. Now, 80% of all of the methamphetamines that are coming into the United States are being used or being created from chemical precursors that are coming from China. So we're experiencing this every day as we're walking through Washington, D.C., and it's a very different form of meth than the original sort of form of meth. So again, it's Chinese pharmaceutical industry that's doing this. The PRC used to be the principal source of finished fentanyl, so they were shipping fentanyl directly to the United States as a finished product. Ever since 2019, they've started to move more towards shipping chemical precursors to Mexico through a lot of the methods that Andres mentioned. This is public, but people in Mexico can go on a search engine and find access to some of these companies. And then they will rely on brokers to sort of oversee those transactions. And as a result, all of those drugs are getting finished in Mexico, and then they make their way up to the United States.
Thank you. I'm glad you referenced the website, because in April 2024, the House Select Committee on China found that the Chinese government was providing financial incentives for domestic companies to produce fentanyl precursors. This was sort of a blockbuster bit of news. Do we have any sense of how long this has been going on for, and whether we made any progress in shutting it down?
Well, so for those of you who are not as familiar with this, this was a really powerful report that came out of the China Select Committee, which has been doing amazing work in general on countering the Chinese Communist Party's influence. But essentially, to give a little context on this report, the question was, okay, we're seeing all of these fentanyl precursors coming to Mexico. We also know that China has one of the most sophisticated surveillance programs in the entire world. So are they turning a blind eye to what's going on, or are they actively encouraging it? And what we discovered was that, or what the China Select Committee discovered, was that they are willfully encouraging this. A lot of this has been amplified since 2019, and the reason I keep mentioning that date is prior to 2019, China didn't have any regulations against fentanyl. In late 2018, there was a summit between Xi and President Trump, and basically they said that we needed to have more cooperation from China on ensuring that fentanyl wasn't coming to the United States. So they decided to start classifying fentanyl precursors and fentanyl analogs, which is basically slightly different chemical structure, but the same effect, and not, that those were now illegal in China. But of course, they wanted to keep making money, and the PRC has a direct interest in trying to undermine the United States. So as a result of that, this report basically, it analyzed, I think, over 37,000 unique data points. They found that this stuff was usually available not on like the dodgy dark web, but just in general, transparently in the public. They found that the CCP was directly subsidizing the manufacturing and export of illicit fentanyl precursors, as well as other narcotics. They did this primarily through tax rebates. And what's really interesting is there were 14 different fentanyl analogs that would provide a tax rebate in the PRC. And some of them received a 13% tax rebate in 2020. That at the time was the highest tax rebate possible for any product coming from the PRC. We saw that they were giving monetary grants and awards to companies that were trafficking in illicit fentanyl. We saw that Chinese CCP officials were praising many of these companies, and some had an ownership interest in those companies. And we also saw that they were failing to prosecute those who were manufacturing fentanyl when it was ever discovered. When Xi was confronted with some of this information about not prosecuting, he essentially said, this isn't a problem here in China. You know, you guys must have a demand problem, that's an America problem. So this is how they're treating the issue. So it's been going on for a long time, but 2019 is really the moment where things started to shift because of this, you know, supposed agreement that Xi gave us and wanting to kind of make it more under the radar.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Carrie. Steve, really glad you're here with us today because I really value your advice and experience on China, but also because I know you're personally invested in this issue. What is China's incentive for mass producing these precursors and incentivizing their export to the United States? Is there a broader, more strategic goal the CCP has? And how do you see this crisis unfolding?
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. This is a difficult topic for me to address, but I'm going to try to swallow the elephant in two different ways to help you understand two parts of my life that intersect with this topic. 26 years ago, I was a policy analyst here at the Heritage Foundation. I had thick glasses and curly hair, and my wife, Michelle, says she would never have dated someone who looked like I did then. It was a different time. It was a different time in China policy, too, because we were still in the midst of a bet that forms of engagement and inducements could shape the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party, and that China more generally might reform and grow and develop its way out of its problems. And our areas of confrontation might lessen, areas of cooperation could expand, and by engaging and integrating China into these systems, we would all be better off, including the Chinese people, but also American interests. Well, also during that time, 26 years ago, a little girl was born in the DC area in the Prince George's County Correctional Facility. And by the miracle of adoption, she came into my family. I never would have imagined that 25 years later, I would be at Heritage talking about my late daughter, who was taken from us by the failure of that bet, by willful ignorance of the warning signs of what the Communist Party of China is, and the failure to take note of where American interests are actually not just being opposed and competed with, but there is a lethal and evil nature to that party. And whether it was from the business case of engagement and coming into the WTO, or looking at other kinds of interaction, I think that the most conservative principle one could have about public policy is, what does the evidence show? It's not going to matter to everyone that my daughter was poisoned by fentanyl. But it should matter to our leaders that over the last 5 years, you have over 300,000 American families where you have brothers and sisters growing up without a brother and sister. You have parents without children. We have an older generation of a workforce who cannot rely on a younger generation of a workforce to pick up and generate jobs and wealth to allow aging people like me to be able to someday retire. Maybe a dream I'll never achieve. But there's a very real life part of how these two worlds come together. There's the policy part and the decision making. It was alluded to by others, where our leaders will engage in dialogue with the leaders of China, the Communist Party, and they'll have meetings, and they'll have working groups and task forces. But to me, the biggest impact the Select Committee's report had was no one can honestly say that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't know. Now, I've been in a lot of government meetings over the course of my career, and a lot of times people who want to push ideas of accommodation, compromise, engagement, deal-making, a legitimate part of life with legitimate partners, they tend to say, well, you know, the Chinese leaders can't really control this. They don't really know about this. The only form of encryption a lot of these people have been using is language for a long time. The failure of Americans to learn enough Chinese it has basically left them not having to have secure communications in doing this, and this was hiding in plain sight. But the other part of this that is also a public policy challenge, and why it's an opening for the Chinese Communist Party to do this, is because Americans don't want to see this either. I know this just from personal experience. You walk into a room or a meeting, you're the guy that lost a child. It's painful. People are uncomfortable. But you know what? There are hundreds of thousands of Americans walking through their everyday life with this. And if we don't take this more seriously, there will be millions. Because the Chinese don't care about those numbers in their government. What is their incentive to do this? What better way to catch up and overtake the United States and the interests the United States and its allies have tried to impose on the world than to have us hollow out from within? Yes, there's the sowing of division and all of that stuff, and they do that pretty well, and we let them. But what if they could distract and destroy American communities in every state? Low income, middle income, high income families, doesn't discriminate on wealth, race, religion, anything. Sometimes people think it's just the addicts that get hit, but it's anybody. My daughter lived through what you would call street life. And some people would say she deserved it. She flew too close to the sun. But I would tell you, she was superhuman. She had survived everything street life could put on her. But there is something categorically different about fentanyl and the drugs that were just being talked about. This is a little human that could survive homelessness, could survive starvation, could survive heroin, and actually was recovered from heroin. But fentanyl shut down her lungs, forced her to aspirate into her lungs, which is a glorified way of saying throwing up into your lungs, cuts off oxygen to your brain, and you are essentially dead unless EMTs get to you and they revive what is left of you. They take you to an emergency room where a heartbeat might be restored, but brain swelling has occurred. For perhaps the lucky, the death is instant. For the unlucky, you have what seems to the layman brain death, but to a neurologist, you don't have brain death. But you have what was left of your loved one on life support, oddly enough, for pain management, being treated with fentanyl for multiple days. It's important for people to see and look into what this is. In some ways, I think that the problem has been that it's so painful that our leaders want to look away. A lot of our citizens want to look away. But we literally can't afford it. Why does the Chinese leadership permit it? Because they can. It's really not much more complicated than that. And what do you think we should do in response to hundreds of thousands of our children being murdered? According to the way we've behaved, the CCP could be forgiven for thinking all we want is more meetings and some kind of a joint communique. I don't. To me, I'll bring it back to the report and the other things that were talked about. If we don't tackle the finances of this, then we are not serious about it. And if the people engaged in this trade don't fear the consequences that our children have endured, then we're not serious about this. They have to fear for their lives as much as we love the lives of our children, or we're not serious about this. And so to me, One of the things that it goes beyond the report, forgive me for being the obnoxious person who says that the report's not enough. It is an excellent report and a very, very good start. But I think it's important for people to look at the illicit precursors of fentanyl and things like it, because today's fentanyl will be tomorrow's something else. These are weapons of mass destruction. And anyone who is engaged in the manufacture and illicit transfer of those kinds of dangerous chemical weapons should face the complete blocking out of our financial system the way we would for chemical weapons generally as WMD. We've had this topic in Washington for a number of years. Some members of Congress have put forward legislation that would take it up. But unless and until the people who are laundering the money or are moving the chemical precursors fear that they will not be able to engage the international financial system or that they will be forced to meet marks, until then, we really aren't serious and we're not honoring the dead in America.
Hear, hear. Thank you for sharing that with us, Steve. I needed to hear that. Everyone in the room needed to hear that. Everyone at home needed to hear that. We do have some time for audience questions. Just a few minutes. Do we have a mic in the back? Thank you.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. Somewhere around 1950, we decided that the Soviet Communist Party was just inconsistent with civilization in general. And we began a campaign that largely succeeded in 42 years. And it's very clear to me that this problem and all the other problems that China brings don't end until we begin the campaign to break the Communist Party of China. I don't see anything. I don't see a secret committee in the NSC. I don't see a campaign to overcome the Great Firewall. I see nothing. I see the Voice of America budget flat or diminishing. I mean, when do we wake up and begin the campaign, which could take another 40 years?
I might just add to what you're saying with, I think it's even worse than what you're describing, because I'll go back to a few years ago when the Biden administration released its national security strategy. I listened to a press conference. I can't remember if it was out of the NSC or out of the State Department, but it was, NSC official one or State Department official one or whoever it was. And they were proud of the fact, and again, mark this as a point of pride, that within the Latin America, Western Hemisphere section of the National Security Strategy, they didn't mention China even one time. So it's not even that they didn't think about it. It's that they thought about it and then said it's a better idea to not say anything at all about it. And it's an issue as it relates not only to the Western Hemisphere, but obviously China has overtaken so many former American, partners and allies around the world. We're seeing how they are using their economic leverage in order to secure geopolitical pledges from countries around the world, whether it's against Taiwan or against the United States. So we do need a real whole-of-government approach that looks at China and combating China within all of our regional and functional portfolios, because absent that, we're just going to keep picking things off one little bit at a time, and we're never going to address the real head of the beast and the real problem.
Anyone else like to take that, or shall we move on?
It's an endless topic in some ways. I would just simply add in that I think as Americans, it's probably too much for people to imagine doing something now that would fundamentally change what's happening inside of China. But we had better damn well get ready to change what's happening inside of America and work with our allies to change what's happening in their societies. And it's going to have to move from those concentric rings outward. The government of China, it doesn't deserve anything from us at this point. We don't owe them anything. They actually owe us. But it's up to us to become less dependent on them. And it's only going to only going to work if we are working among ourselves and with our friends and allies to be less dependent, to be more resilient, to create alternative paths. If we didn't have a young generation of people who are so dependent on mood management medications and other kinds of things, we wouldn't have pill presses with off-market ADHD and Xanax that ends up getting laced with fentanyl, people not knowing that they have that. But there's tons of what, if we don't do those things, there's no way we're pulling off a strategy to win the minds of people inside of China for them to change their reality. For me, I would be happy just to have forward progress toward containing the malign influences of the CCP, rejuvenate our own health, faith, strength, etc. And if they choose not to change, then I feel very badly for the people of China that will continue to be long-suffering under this evil regime. But it's not my job to change their government. But it is our job to protect our children and honor our alliances and organize our way of life around that. To me, that is where I feel like we are as a country on that. The net effect may be the result that you were talking about, but we'll never get there if we can't even have a firm agreement that this organization is evil, toxic, and it's bad for the Chinese people, and it's bad for the rest of us. It took a long time for people to come to that conclusion with the Soviet Union. I mean, there was still romancing of the Soviet Union pushing for agreements even in the 1980s as Reagan was ramping up to have the wall torn down. So I take your point of perspective that we've got a long way to go, but I hope that this is the kind of thing that is jarring and a wake-up call for us to do the right things, to have the pieces in the place to mitigate the damage and build up the options that are better for making that change that you talked about. But I agree with the end objective.
Just real quick, I just please to go off of that. The idea of countering China, I think that's 10 steps from where we are right now. Is alluding to it would be great if we could stop empowering China and empowering really the same actors and industries that are actively targeting the United States. We're wholly dependent. We've created a massive pharmaceutical industry and chemical industry in China by exporting all of that into China. That was a decision that has left us vulnerable, not only in the scenario of a conflict where there's some kind of attempt to manipulate that, but also, as we're seeing now, by empowering these companies which have complete immunity and shielding and actually have the malign influence of the Chinese Communist Party being pressed against them to undermine the United States, as we're seeing with this fentanyl crisis. We are essentially empowering them to target the United States. So that's one of the first steps, and that's something we talk about in the paper, is we need to be able to protect the United States from the very actors. And again, these are very often the same companies that we're buying medicine from are the sources for these chemicals that are going to the cartels. We should cut that relationship up immediately if we want to actually get to this crisis at its roots.
Thank you. We have time for just one more, sadly. She's very enthusiastic here.
I'm going to give you the China connection. Actually, fentanyl was created by a very reputable pharmaceutical chemist named Paul Janssen from Belgium. He took the most active part of morphine, tweaked it, and then because he was upset that the last analgesic he created, Tylenol, wasn't strong enough, he thought. He wanted a stronger analgesic. And so he tweaked morphine, part of it, and made fentanyl. Then it began to be used in Europe as an analgesic, and in a very short time, they limited it to use with anesthesia. But then his company, Janssen Pharmaceuticals, I'm talking in the 60s, 1967 about, okay? His company was the first Western pharmaceutical company to open a manufacturing plant in China. Now, it's not that Paul allowed them to make fentanyl there. In fact, it was other things they wanted to have China be making or being made in China. However, I'm certain that the way of making fentanyl was certainly leaked over to China through that company. Now, Janssen Pharmaceuticals was purchased by Johnson & Johnson. And also, not too long after that, I mean, again, I'm talking many years ago, the FDA permitted the use of fentanyl as an analgesic for people who had cancer. Of course, a lot of things have changed. But anyway, that was the first China connection I could find. Mm-hmm. And the stuff is so darn potent, it takes only like a few crystals of salt, about that much of it, to kill you.
Okay.
It's very, very potent. So now it's being used along with other things like heroin and whatnot because it's so cheap to make and it can make them be so strongly active. Well, anyway, I didn't really have a question, but I just thought you might like to know the China connection.
Thank you. We very much appreciate the context. I'm getting the sign that unfortunately our event has come to an end. It's good to see so many hands up because it shows that there is great interest in this topic. Please join me in giving a round of applause to our audience, to Andrew Harding as well for introducing us, organizing this event, and co-authoring the paper. Andres, great work. Steve, thank you for sharing that. Carrie, thank you so much.